Hey everybody, this is Clint, and I just wanted to thank you guys for joining us for this bonus episode with Dr. Stuart Ablon, our president and CEO, Rich Graziano, and our chief clinical officer, Dave Paxton. If you're watching this on YouTube, we had a couple technical difficulties, and this will be an audio-only episode. Thanks again for joining us. Let's explore that.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to replace professional medical advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not reflect the views of the Village Network. If you are struggling with mental health, please see our show notes for a list of resources.
Dave.
Hey. Hey, how you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Good to see you. It's been a long time.
Yeah, you guys look very professional up there.
Yeah, well, you know.
They did a good job putting this together.
Yeah, it's cool. Like it.
Well, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Appreciate you having me.
Absolutely. Me and Dave actually were just touching base a little bit this morning on the journey, the 12-year journey getting from where we were to here. So
12 years. Wow.
Yeah, we started with Perry. Yeah. And he's the one that introduced us to you.
Is that right? I forget at this point. That's great.
Yeah.
That's great.
So I told Dave it might be interesting in him starting out on how we kind of started, like springboarded the whole shift that we had from 12 years ago when we were using like point systems and the mentality of the kids and things along those lines and how we came to right now. And I kind of started aging myself because I was talking about when I was like a BMS and we worked with the point systems back when I was working in New York, and I was telling him back then, you knew it was wrong. And I was telling Dave that I was as part of the leadership development there, they made all the BMS staff here, which is like the direct care workers back in that day, they made us go through a process where we had to pair up with a clinician and do like a research project on something that would help the organization. So
that's cool.
I thought it was a great idea. And I was 24, 25 years old working in one of the houses, and I picked non-contingent reinforcement. And the therapist did a really good job of helping me set up the study. And I wanted to show how the non-contingent reinforcement didn't work with the kids. So then this is going back. I told Dave, this is when it ages me. This is going back like 25 years ago. That's when I first started. So like kind of then it just like I kind of knew. And I told him like that's what kind of drove me to stay in the field when I didn't think I was going to be in there for a long period of time. Because when I did the study, it was just so compelling and it was like almost concrete of the difference between the individuals with the point system and and then going to like non-contingent reinforcement where you just real life consequences and watching them how they improved. It was like a no-brainer, and I felt that it kind of drove me to want to get into a position to be able to make that kind of change. And it's just kind of sad in a way that it took so long for me to get into a position here 12 years ago after starting in the field 25 years ago to be able to make that huge change.
Well, although better that it happened, period, because there are programs and places where it hasn't happened.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
I was telling Rich this morning, Dr. Ablon, that your philosophy has helped more than anything. Your philosophy, your approach to CPS has helped us with a lot of things, but your philosophy, the kids do well if they can, has helped us more than anything else as we removed those point and level systems from the programs. It has shaped our philosophy of treatment more than anything else. Could you speak? Could you explain your philosophy to the audience? The philosophy of CPS.
Yeah, sure. The philosophy is kids do well if they can. And what kids do well if they can suggests is if a kid could do well, they would do well. And if they're not doing well, it's up to us helpers to try to figure out what's getting in their way so we can help. But the real power, Dave, that I think you're pointing to in this philosophy is how different it is from more traditional ways of thinking about kids when they exhibit different forms of concerning behavior. Because the more common way to think about kids, as you know, is kids do well if they want to. And if you believe kids do well if they want to, and a kid isn't doing well, which is how they land in your care of places like yours in the first place, you believe kids do well if they want to, they're not doing well, you're going to believe that the reason they're not doing well is because they're just not trying hard, that within their control, they're just not properly motivated, or that they're just using their behavior to sort of get what they want or get out of what they want and things like that. And so kids do well if they can just reminds everybody that, no kid prefers doing poorly to doing well. All kids want to do well. And it can't be as simple as they're just lacking motivation. And I think, Dave, you point out how important that philosophy is. I have to say, I think it's more than half the battle. I mean, I think using an approach like collaborative problem solving, our approach with fidelity, is very important. But the most important thing is that mindset shift. It's going from kids do well if they want to, we just got to make them want to kids do well if they can. And when you encounter trouble, when it gets hard, because it invariably does, right? Like, it's challenging. Being in direct care, trying to help these kids, it's really hard. And when the going gets tough, if you can remind yourself, okay, wait a second, kids do well if they can. As hard as it is for me, imagine what it's like for this kid. And I'm sure they're doing the best they can. And you mentioned Dr. Perry earlier. One of the things Bruce Perry always reminds us of is the importance of the adults staying regulated and calm and available. And I think he's often said that the philosophy itself behind our approach, kids do well if they can, is regulating for adults. Because if we're repeating that mantra to ourselves, we're much less likely to take it personally. Because when you take a kid's behavior personally, you get angry yourself, you get resentful, you get pissed off, and you reach for power and control to try to sort of regain your composure. So when adults embrace the mindset, kids do well if they can, it keeps the adult calm, empathic, accessible as well.
Yeah, I recently saw, I think it was on your website or maybe a publication of Think Kids, and it said the child's not having a hard time, they're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. Right. That helps our staff have perspective.
What's the power of that one word when you think of like can and want? Like by just changing that one word in that statement, it's everything. Because how many times you hear adults say, like, I don't understand why they would do that. Why would they want to argue? Why would they want to be in trouble? And I remember listening to you talk the first time, and I'm like, oh my God, it's so basic. It makes so much sense. And I thought of myself as a parent that time with young kids. Like, I would say that to my wife all the time. Like, why would they do that? Like, why do they always want to be in trouble? And then I'm hearing you talk, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I'm horrible. Like, of course they don't want to be in trouble all the time. Like, they don't know. Like, I'm not doing my job as a parent and teaching them what to do so they won't be in trouble, so they could do better. And it seems so simple. But how many people really think about it like that?
Well, one of the things I love about the philosophy, though, too, as you both know, it doesn't just apply to kids, right? Like, we're talking about kids do well if they can, but let's be clear, we adults do well if we can too, right? Direct care staff do well if they can, clinicians do well if they can, administrators, parents do well if they can, people do well if they can. We are all doing the best we can to handle what the world is throwing at us with the skills we're able to bring to the moment. And so I try to work really hard not to blame the adults for having a mindset that may have been inaccurate or unhelpful. It's not like they were trying to. They're like, oh, let me hold on to this belief that has been disproven by science that's going to actually make things worse. Like, I really want to do that. No, parents and other adults, we're doing the best we can as well. And I think to restate what we were talking about before, also, it's all about how regulated or dysregulated we are, because it's easy to hold on to this mindset when you're calm, when you're thoughtful, when you're operating from a place where your cortex is open for business. It's when we get dysregulated, and being around a lot of challenging behavior is really dysregulated. It's when we feel disrespected or like our authority is being challenged, we feel ineffective, things like that. that sends us, into a tailspin, and it's harder to hold on to the notion like this.
Well, I've noticed in our programs, as the program and the staff in the program get more dysregulated, that conventional wisdom, that conventional thinking creeps back into the program of rewards and punishments, and it happens that they're not even aware of it.
And in every program, the programs who do so well at this, it ebbs and flows, right? You might just have a particular time where there's a certain amount of acuity within a program, or a couple of kids who really have a hard time with each other, and dysregulation is contagious, right? So those two kids are very dysregulated, the other kids get dysregulated, the staff get dysregulated, and then you're absolutely right, Dave. Then people start saying, I really like this collaborative problem solving thing, but there's got to be a place for plan A here. I mean, there's got to be a place for punishments, right? Right. I'm all in favor of collaboration, but we need structure. We need, and then, you've got to sort of regulate the adults again, try to understand where they're coming from, why they're getting so frustrated, and sort of get people back on track. But that's a natural ebbing and flowing.
But why do you think the philosophy is so counterintuitive to just basic culture?
I think the reality is most of us have been raised, through a sort of more traditional parenting, and schools and other places we spent our times as kids. They tend to utilize what we refer to as plan A to solve problems. I mean, they basically are like, hey, the bigger, stronger person is going to decide how this goes, and your job is to listen and comply. And so, it's just, that's how we're taught. And it's hard to change how you think and how you practice, and especially if you're around a lot of, challenging behavior. So it's tough. And the other thing I guess I would say is we've learned so much about the brain, right? Like, we've learned so much, back 50 years ago, like, we didn't know what we know now. So it was more reasonable to hold on to beliefs like that. I always draw an analogy with things like learning disabilities, where like 50 years ago, people didn't know what learning disabilities were. So they assumed kids who just weren't trying hard enough to read and stuff like that. Now, fast forward to today, I mean, the kid struggling to read, you're really not keeping up with what we know in the world if you don't consider, I wonder what they're having a hard time with here. So, we're still in a place where, even though the research is there, we've learned so much more. It takes a long time for people to change their mindset, and then practices to change as well. And so we've got decades of research that shows that, kids who struggle to manage their behavior, it's about skill, not will. But decades, that's short in human evolution. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to take a little longer until that can become sort of a fundamental way of thinking for us.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. But I think the same thing. Like, my son probably thinks, or the kids we're even working with the staff, they're probably thinking, well, why do they always want to give me why do they want to give me a hard time? But it's like you said, they fall into that trap of, that's exactly how I was raised. Like, my father said something, you did not challenge it. You did not talk back. He was in charge. So what he said went. And when my kids wouldn't fall in line with that, I'd tell them, what's the matter with them? Like, it worked for me. Like, why aren't they listening? Not realizing that the issue is really not with them. It's with my approach of it is not working. And I felt like they should just listen because I said so. And I would do the same thing. Stupid, consequences, like, oh, you're never going out again. Or it's like just silly things that
And look, those things can work, if you will, with kids who have good skills at being able to tolerate frustration, be flexible, problem solve. They'll do what you want, but I'm not sure that should be our goal, is just getting to achieving compliance because we're bigger and stronger. Like, exactly. You can make a convincing argument that's what's wrong with the world, is that when there are problems in the world, adults tend to line up, see who's bigger and stronger, and that person's going to try to impose their will upon others. We're really bad at perspective taking, understanding other points of views, things like that. So, that's a whole other thing here, is we have a chance to raise a new generation of adults who could be better at some of this stuff than we are. But, I think one of the things, guys, that I want to point out here for people who are watching and listening is, sometimes people misinterpret and think that I'm suggesting that you should never use a reward or a consequence with a child ever, right? And they'll be like, "You've got kids, right? I got 3 of my own. You're going to tell me you've got to use reward or consequence?" And I'll be like, "Wait a second. That's really a fundamental misunderstanding here. I'm not anti-reward and consequence. I think you can use rewards and consequences for things they're good at. Just don't use them for things that they were never intended to be used for, and then be surprised when they don't work and they make matters worse."
Right.
And what's fascinating in programs like yours and the kids you serve in your organization is, they're the kids that we're talking about are struggling with things that rewards and consequences were never, ever intended to address. And perhaps the clearest thing ever is if you have a kid with an activated stress response who's sort of tuned up, right? Or in language, you go from 0 to 60 real quick, right?
We have a few of those.
And those are, kids with trauma histories tend to have activated stress response. Well, guess what? We end up using contingency-based approaches, rewards, consequences, things like that with those kids. They were never, ever intended to help kids who have a hard time staying calm, stay calm. And if you really step back and think about it, it's like a little bit like, well, wait a sec, duh. Because if a kid is starting to go from 0 to 60 and somebody comes up to them and is like, "Hey, if you keep acting that way, you're going to lose this privilege." I always tell people, I don't know about you all, but if I'm getting pissed off about something and somebody's like, "Hey, if you keep acting that way, life's about to get worse," I'm not like, "Oh, wow, thank you." Wow. Here I was getting upset, but knowing life's going to get worse, that is so helpful. My cortex back online. Let's talk, right? No, what it does is it throws emotional fuel on the fire. So they can work fine for kids who, can tolerate a decent amount of stress, have good skills like that. But it's just, they were never intended to build complicated thinking skills. They were never intended to build helping relationships between adults and kids. And they were never intended to help kids who have a hard time staying calm, stay calm. Not their fault. Let's not blame rewards and consequences. Frankly, if I'm being honest with you, they don't deserve the blame. We deserve the blame for using them for things they were never, ever intended to be used for. And then being like, "Oh, wow, they're not working." But it's not only that. They actually make matters worse when you use them for things they were not intended to be used for.
Correct. We were talking about that earlier today. If you have a reward system that's even spread out during the day and the youth does something and they lose that reward, well, then what do they have to lose after that? So,
it's a ridiculous system. Let's be honest. People say to me all the time, "But that's how the world works." I'm like, wait a second.
Not really.
How the world works. I don't know about you all, but I get paid once a month. Some people get paid every 2 weeks or 1 week or something. I'm not measured on the hour of performance and how I did this hour versus the next. And, if I messed up early in the day, well, I'm not going to get paid for that whole day. So screw the whole thing. It's just, it doesn't mirror reality either.
Yeah, that's exactly what I told Dave this morning. Exactly. I said, if you make one mistake during the week, you don't get your pay withheld at the end of the week. It's a mistake.
Right. And just to be clear, again, people who really study token economy systems and things like that will say, well, that's very poor implementation of a reward system like that, and that you should never do that. And that's absolutely the case. And you can have better schedules of reinforcement and you can fix implementation, things like that. And yet, they're only going to work for things they were intended to be good at. And so use them for those things. Don't use them for things they were not intended to be used for.
Yeah, and that was the big shift I think we saw, is that getting away from that point system of reward was just one of the best things we ever did for our kids.
It's been a struggle, but we've after several years we're there. We're finally there, and the CPS philosophy. We just recently had a leadership academy, and the the participants in the leadership academy, Village Network employees, presented a capstone presentation at the end of their project. And I was so pleased with how much the CPS philosophy was part of their capstone projects, along with Dr. Perry's 6 R's. The philosophy of staff do well if they can. Yeah,
it was promising seeing where they were coming from and their philosophy of the organization, how to prove it and different things that they wanted to implement moving forward. But that's like the stage 2. So they graduate from it and their projects are accepted. And then stage 2 is now they actually have to get working groups, and they'll work with other employees to implement some of their strategies into the organization. So we're trying to expand that culture of like not only kids would do well if they can, but employees, staff will do well if they can. So we need to give them the ability to be successful.
I think I saw recently in that what Rich is saying, I think I saw at a conference I was at, a poster presentation. I think Kids had a poster presentation on using the philosophy or CPS in the workplace.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So are organizations using CPS as a philosophy of management?
Absolutely. I mean, let's be clear about something. It's really hard to implement an approach like this if leaders don't practice what they preach. I mean, how can you expect staff to collaborate with kids when their manager or supervisor are not collaborating with them? I mean, it's incredibly hypocritical. But here's the thing. Staff do well if they can. I mean, nobody's signing up to do a poor job at work. People want to do well, right? So the cool thing is everything about the approach applies. So not just the philosophy, staff do well if they can, but the awareness that if a staff member is struggling to meet your expectations as their manager, their supervisor, the leader of the program, et cetera, well, it's probably much more about skill than will. It's probably that they are struggling to handle the expectations in front of them. And so what do you want to do? You want to try to help them figure out which skills need some help developing. And then you want to partner with them to see how you can do that. And for leaders of organizations, like let's say you decide to do away with the point and level system. It's going to get ugly before it gets better. And you're going to have all kinds of problems. Yep. And if you're imposing that upon the staff, when it doesn't go well, it's your fault. And everybody's looking at you. Whereas if you're collaborating with each other to try to come up with solutions for how this is going to look together, everybody's on the hook. Everybody's invested because they're co-authors. So absolutely. And I can tell you, even in my own program, I'm constantly thinking to myself, all right, here's a problem. How are we going to handle it? And guess what? I got 3 options. And, if you hold the power, you could do plan A, but you should think about what's going to happen if you do it. You always have plan C as an option. But really, ultimately, what you want to spend most of your time doing is collaborating with your team members to try to solve problems in durable ways that everybody's happy with.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And sorry, just to be clear, like I have examples of, there's times you can't do plan B. There's times you must do plan A. There's some times that it makes sense to do plan C. But by and large, when you've got a chronic problem that keeps coming up and it's causing problems, you better double down on trying to understand people's perspectives and concerns and where they're coming from and inviting them to the table to problem solve.
Yeah. It's hard, isn't it, though? Collaborating with others.
It's really hard. You probably remember, Dave, I used to show an old cartoon in trainings that this guy's sitting across from somebody else in a room, and he's like, I think the collaborative process would work better without you. And collaboration is hard. And sometimes really tempting to just go plan A, especially when you feel like I have the power to be able to do it. But it'll come back to bite.
Yeah.
Well, it's easier in the short term. It'll usually come back to bite you.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm curious too. We're curious about how, I think you first trained with us 10 years ago. How has your approach changed? How, and what, I guess, big question, what big lessons have you learned over the years?
Great question. A great question. I mean, we've been talking a lot about things that I think were evolutions of the model. The model had all the basics in place, but I firmly believe, as you would hope for somebody teaching collaborative problem solving, that when you collaborate with other really smart people, you improve things, you make things better. I think we had a great approach. But then, for instance, getting to know Bruce Perry, becoming friends with him, teaching with him, it changed and evolved my thinking and really had a big influence on how we teach collaborative problem solving today as a neurobiologically informed, trauma-sensitive approach. And so, I think that's been a big piece of development of the model. I would say the other place that's been really big is we've spent a lot of time really trying to examine the approach through a lens of cultural responsiveness and cultural humility. Because, I think there's a lot about the basic tenets of the approach that can promote cultural humility. But, you've got to be really careful. If you're teaching anything in a rigid or dogmatic way, by default, it's not going to be particularly inclusive and responsive. So, I think one of the sort of developments in the model is that we have our philosophy. We believe strongly in it. We teach people the philosophy, but we honor people's individual perspectives, experiences, concerns, and it's not upon us to say, this is how you should do something. It's upon us to teach people, here's some options, here's what they accomplish, here's what they don't accomplish. And sort of let's walk together on this path. And we're not going to tell you what to do, but we can add some value in terms of how you might go about addressing some of the goals you have. And that flexibility in the approach, meeting people where they're at, I think is been a big development in recent years.
Okay. That's interesting. So, but can you say more about the cultural sensitivity piece?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, some cultures, for instance, people are much more accustomed to a use of Plan A. And, if you come sort of barging in saying, hey, Plan A is not the way to go, and here's the problem with it, and, no, you should be doing more Plan B. And they'll be like, you don't even understand who I am and where I come from. And like, no, like that, so, and that's just one example, right? There are plenty of examples that you can talk about, even when it comes through just understanding that behavior can look very different in different cultures, different contexts, different settings, and jumping to the conclusion that this is sort of a challenging behavior or a, quote, maladaptive behavior. Well, no, we don't know that yet. Let's try to understand where this behavior is coming from, what it's about, what it's expressing, how it's perceived. So the point is, like, we are experts on how to do collaborative problem solving. We're not experts in people's homes, people's cultures, people's neighborhoods, people's organizations. We got to understand where everybody's coming from. And this is what's nice about the model is, I think the bedrock of the model is saying, I'm not going to assume anything. I want to gather information and understand your perspective, your point of view, and I have things to share as well. But then it's ultimately, this is a collaboration, and it's up to you to decide how you want to go about pursuing the goals that you have, because they're your goals.
Yes, I think for me, I feel like that's one of the biggest challenges when we're dealing with the kids. Like, we get them in one of our programs and we're working the models, and the models are working, and the staff is going about that way with the kids, and you see the progress. But then what happens? They're going to leave that program, and unless we have an opening at wherever they're being discharged to the next level, unless we can do it internally, they're losing that whole culture, that whole collaborative approach that we have clinically. And they're either going to go back home, right? So if the family's not open to coming in and learning the collaborative problem-solving approach and that philosophy to implement at home, it's going to be an issue when they get back home. Or if they're referred to another organization that doesn't have that philosophy, they're going to go into it, and the treatment is going to be totally different. And the kid's going to be like, well, what the hell just happened? And things are going to go downhill. And that's the biggest concern, is that is somehow developing some type of consistency within the field.
As a matter of fact, we've had families that parents they express frustration or they're angry with us because they don't think we're holding their kid accountable enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so here's, I guess, to your question. I can give you a great one-liner for how to respond to a family about that. If they're saying, how am I going to hold my kids accountable? Right? Here's your one-liner. I will say to them, I can't think of a better way to hold a kid accountable than put them on the hook to solve the problem so it doesn't keep coming up. I mean, you're going to tell me being on the receiving end of a consequence is accountability? That's taking responsibility?
Yeah.
It's a joke. That's a totally lame way to hold somebody accountable. You really want to hold them accountable. They're on the hook for working together to solve the problem so it doesn't keep coming up. The ultimate form of accountability. Okay. So that's a fairly convincing take, people mostly tell me. Right? But I think it's a mistake to, when the parent says to you, how hold my kid accountable, to just come out guns blazing with that response. Because what you really ought to do is say, well, fill me in. Because I don't want to jump to conclusions about what you mean by hold them accountable. Like, fill me in. I'm curious what you're talking about, what's important to you about that, how you found it hard to do that. I've got some ideas, but I want to hear you out first. So in other words, collaborating with the parent, and not just imposing collaborative problem solving on people. Because if it's a poor cultural fit too, they're just going to dissociate, nod away and say, it's great. What a waste of time in their program. And now they're back in my family in real life. So, that's an example of what I mean about really trying to understand people's perspectives and concerns and their unique, contexts, and trying to collaborate with them rather than say, we're the smart people who know how this should go. You just need to learn this from us. I mean, that's not a particularly enlightened point of view, nor is it consistent with the whole approach in the first place.
Maintaining that curiosity.
Yeah, and working together with people. Yeah, because it's got to fit for them. It's got to make sense for them in their family, their situation, their context, their neighborhood, their culture, or else, it's not going to take anyways, even if you try to impose it.
No, you're right. I mean, I can relate to it so much because I just you should probably do a study on my family, because I think it will be textbook to this working and not working, because I was raised exactly the way we're saying, like, it doesn't work. That was the way it was. And I saw that when I tried to do it in my house, because that's all I knew, it did not work. And working in this field, I mean, it really shed light on it, but I also know how much I remember listening to it and thinking, my gosh, this is the way. Like I said, my kids were young when we were first got introduced to, you introduced me to Perry, and then to you, when you came down. And I remember just listening to both of you talk, and I went home and I told my wife, we got to do this. But I know the challenge was not going to be with my wife. It was going to be with me because of how I was raised. It was, it's repetition. It took a lot of effort for me to make that change with my kids, years. But as I got better with it, I noticed the change. To the point when my son said one day, wow, I've seen a total change in how you deal with everybody in the house, because the more I got accustomed to doing it in repetition and was able to implement it, the whole dynamic and culture of my house changed. Yeah. And the best compliment I could have got was getting that feedback from my son that he actually noticed it.
Totally.
But it was hard. It almost killed me when I heard it, that he was giving me some credit in this. But it took a lot of work. And I think that's why it's just so hard, because people who aren't doing this and seeing it on a regular basis and don't have the access, on a regular basis to people like you and Bruce, it's hard for them to understand the concept. Because if I wasn't doing this and someone told me this, I'd be like, no, man, I run my house the way I want. People do what I say. But
right,
it's so basic, and it works so well with the kids.
But part of the reason it's so hard is it's hard to change the brain, and it's particularly hard to change the adult brain.
Yes,
right,
100%.
the notion of you can't teach an old dog new tricks, that's actually not true, right? You can teach an old dog new tricks. If you couldn't, we'd be in real trouble. So you can, but it takes a lot longer and it takes a lot more repetition and things like that. But it sounds like what happened in your family is it became just sort of like second nature, sort of a way of operating.
Right.
And that's what I always tell people is like, it's less important that like, if I had a, video of your interactions in your home, that I'd be grading you on your implementation and thinking, wow, you really got an A-, you're really doing this great. It's less important. It's more important that you embrace the notion of people do well if they can, that when there's a problem, you're stopping and being curious, not judgmental, not rushing to judgment, that you're really trying to understand. And that ultimately you try your best not to sort of impose your perspective or solutions, but invite people to the table to try to collaborate. And if that's happening, it's in the water, which is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think it's important too to stress that nobody's perfect. So like both at work, where I try more and more to implement it, and at home, I've done a really horrible job at times of doing it consistently, but it's the reaction to it when it happens, I think, that means the most. Like if someone calls you on it and you acknowledge it and you're able to correct it, and that's what you want to teach to your kids.
Well, and even in the work, we were talking about the workplace, I'm laughing because like, you would hope in our program, for instance, that I am the one that is always encouraging people to avoid plan A and to use plan B. I'm laughing because I can't tell you how many times like something irritates me and I get the plan A itch. And, my colleagues in the program are the one to remind me. And these are not necessarily clinicians, but these are folks who know the model really well. And they're the ones who remind me, well, slow down here. But, maybe we ought to hear them out first and sort of see what's going on. And then we can decide. And almost invariably when we do that, I'm always like, oh my God, thank goodness we didn't jump to plan A, because when you are curious instead of judgment, you often learn information that has you then being like, oh God, of course, this makes a lot more sense. Right. And I'm so glad I didn't head down that path, getting all pissed off and trying to impose my will. Because now that I understand this, I have a lot more empathy, and I know that's not really going to solve the problem anyways. And now we're situated to work together.
And that's that key, is creating that culture at your workplace or at your home where people are going to call you out on that and know that you'll be open to hearing it. When you do, you're like, oh my gosh, you're right. Instead of having the reaction, an adverse reaction to it where you shut them down. That's a big... So
that's why you need people around you who are reminding you and sort of keeping you honest with the philosophy and the process. And at work, that's having a whole team of people who are aware of it. It's at home, if your kids in a 2-parent household, it's your partner or your spouse being the one to sort of keep you on track, and vice versa.
Yeah, it makes great sense.
When we first implemented the models, NMT and CPS, we had staff quit over it, and particularly with the removing the point and level systems.
Oh, yeah.
There's something about that whole issue that it triggers some folks. I think it's related to how they themselves were raised as children, and if their parents, how they're raising their own parents. But now we have folks who've been around for a while that absolutely love CPS. I mean, they wouldn't do anything else but that because they've been trained in it. They see the impact that it has, and same thing with NMT. We've come full circle with introducing it and getting it into our culture.
Well, if you don't have people around that know the end result of it, and they see that point system comes out, like you had said earlier, you're going to see things are going to get bad before they get better. And they see that bad and they want to default back to that to regain control. And when they're not allowed, you're not allowing them to do that, to push forward, the majority of them are like, I'm out. And that's what we saw, that turnover. So we're lucky people stuck with it so they can speak to, hey, I've seen the turnaround. If we do this, everything is going to be way easier.
I think the other thing is people fear if you move away from systems of rewards and consequences that all hell is going to break loose. And honestly, if you don't have anything else to do in their place, all hell will break loose.
Right.
You can't just take them away. This is one of the key things. Like, initiatives to, for instance, reduce restraint and seclusion. Great, but you can't just take them away. You've got to have something else staff to do, right?
Right.
The same thing with the point and level system. But I think there's one other issue, which is people conflate or confuse use of point and level systems, rewards, consequences, things like that, and structure. So what their fear is,
Right.
if you take that away, we'll have no structure. And people say this all to me all the time. They're like, are you saying that like you don't need structure for kids? And I'm like, whoa, hold on a second. No, of course, structure is important for every child in some way. But you got to help people understand that having a structure, having clear expectations for kids, and how you handle it when they don't meet your expectations, when they don't adhere to the structure. Those are two different things. So we don't want our structures going anywhere. We want clear expectations. But when kids have a hard time meeting them, we aren't just going to jump to plan A. We're going to be thoughtful and see we've got different options for how to handle when kids aren't adhering to the structure. But knowing the difference between structure, response to it not being met, I think is really important.
In an ironic way, Rich and I were talking this morning. I think you already said this, but in a way, removing the point and level systems and implementing NMT and CPS has actually resulted in, for lack of a better way to say it, kids being held more responsible. Because I was giving Rich the example of a child who runs away all the time, and they go out on an activity and he runs away. So we say to them, you're not going to go this time because we want you to be successful, and I'm afraid you're going to run away again. You don't have the skills to stop yourself from running away. So we'll help you build those skills, but until then, you're going to stay back with the staff. And that brings it home. He's not staying back because he didn't earn points.
Right.
He's staying back because we're afraid he's at risk.
And it's a real world consequence too. It's like it's a consequence that makes sense. It's not like you're taking away his basketball time outside or his video game time, which has no bearing on the fact that he's going to run away in public.
Right.
It's a safety concern. So you're relating hopefully to something the kid can relate to.
And people will hear that though, and they'll be like, "Oh, see, you did Plan A. I thought you weren't supposed to do that." And that's where we say, "No, it's not the Plan A." This is an evolution of the approach as well. Plan A is not there as this like straw person, like this is what you shouldn't do ever.
Plan A is an option, right?
Yeah, it's one of the three options. And there's times where you need to use it, but just be aware that it's not going to solve the problem.
Right.
So if you have to do Plan A in the meantime to keep the kids safe, okay, but let's get down to business trying to figure out why are they running away? What's going on? Exactly. What skills are they struggling with? And how can we start to build those skills? And that's saying A for now, while we get Plan B up and running and working.
Exactly. And that's what I like about it. It's just, you're not just doing it to do it as, well, you did this. So until you stop doing that, this is what you don't get. And the kid obviously can't develop that skill himself. You're solving the problem with him. So he or she can get whatever it is that they want, which is to go out and socialize and have a good time. And that's what I really love about this, is that I hate, those point systems. I used to hate taking things away from the kids when they would start with the points. They would do something and take the points away and take the points away, and the kid's seeing the points go away, and there's no way to build it back. So you're constantly taking from the kid, and they're getting more mad and pissed off as you're taking those points away, and then there's no going back. At the end of the week, if they don't earn, that's what the most dangerous person is someone with nothing to lose. So if the kid has no points and they have nothing to lose, who the hell is going to want to work in that house?
Well, it's funny. Sometimes people will say to me when they'll agree with that, but then they'll be like, so that's why actually we don't take things away in our program. Like we don't use consequences. And I'm always interested. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And they're like, well, we only use rewards. Well, like we just offer incentives, but we don't take things away, which is like really funny, right? Because it's like great marketing, right? Because like rewards and consequences are flip sides of the same coin, right? Like you can't just offer incentives and not have consequences, because what happens when it doesn't earn those incentives, right?
Right.
Where I come from, we call that a consequence.
Yeah.
So, so sometimes we try to fool ourselves a little into sort of thinking that we're only using quote positive discipline, when I'm not sure that's quite ever possible entirely. Just using rewards.
Increasingly, Dr. Perry and others have been increasingly using the term developmental trauma, complex trauma. And we have a lot of those children who have in our out-of-home care, especially our residential programs. But the staff who are sometimes struggling with our clinical models and our approaches with the kid, particularly a very challenging kid, they'll suggest, removing a privilege or taking something away from them. And I explain to them, that's not going to be impactful on that child. They've been through things you can't imagine. And we're going to take away a trip to the YMCA for them.
Right.
Right. So it's all about perspective and understanding the child's perspective and what they've been through and where they're trying to get to.
I always tell people, look, if all it took was more motivation for this kid, kinds of kids we're talking about, they have all the motivation in the world to actually be behaving in ways that are going to protect them, advance their interests, all kinds of things like that. They have all the motivation in the world. It cannot be as simple as they are just not trying hard enough. And we alluded to this early in this discussion. It's not just that that's not going to be impactful, it's that it's not going to work, but it actually really sends the wrong message, because the message it sends is, I think you're not trying hard enough to do well here. Because why else would we be using rewards and consequences unless we supposedly smart adults who are in charge were very clear that part of the problem here is you're not trying hard enough?
That's a great
point. It becomes a case of this is what a kid starts to believe about themselves. And most of the kids who, have been in and out of programs for most of their life, they've been taught this message again and again and again, and they come to believe it. I guess I'm just not trying hard enough. And that is really dangerous to a kid's self-concept. And so that's why it's not just that these things aren't effective for certain kids in certain situations, but it's the damage they can cause. Dramatically decrease internal motivation and harm a kid's self-esteem massively, because they come to think of themselves as somebody who's not trying hard enough. I thought I was trying hard, but I guess I must not be, because everybody's treating me like I'm not.
Yeah.
That's a great point. It really is. When we were talking about doing this, Dave had brought up a paper that I had written when I first started, and I went on my computer. I'm like, man, I wonder if I still have that. And I found it from 2013, and it's kind of what spurred this whole movement. We were talking about arts and wellness and really dealing with the whole youth and ways to motivate them. And Dave had, when I had sent it out, Dave read it, and he comes up and he's like, I've been doing this NMT thing, man. He goes, you got to read on it. He's like, no one knows about it, but it's working real good with my kids. And I'm like, send me the stuff. And I remember reading it, and it's just like all this stuff you're talking about. And it made perfect sense about motivating the kids, making them feel positive, because they've had a negative perspective on everything, the majority of their lives, things taken away, always being punished. And you're right, the self-esteem, that mental fortitude for a kid is so important for them to be successful, and too many adults kill it in the kids.
Yeah, well, and look, we in our trainings these days, we talk a lot about the difference between being between extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation and drive. And when you're using rewards and consequences and things, you're trying to externally motivate kids.
Yeah.
And one of the clearest things we know is the more you use tangible reinforcers to try to motivate a kid to do something, like trips to the YMCA, things like that, the less motivated kids actually are to achieve that goal. I mean, they get motivated to get the stuff and things like that, but they're less motivated to achieve the actual goal you're trying to motivate them to achieve.
Right.
And, conversely, there's a ton of research that shows what fosters internal drive in humans, not just kids, humans, is a sense of mastery. It's a sense of autonomy or independence, and it's a sense of connection or purpose. And so if we really want to motivate these kids, we should be helping them get better at their skills, giving them a fair sense of autonomy and independence, and making sure that they feel connected, related to those around them as we go about our interactions with them. That's sort of the secret recipe, if you will, to internal drive.
That's fantastic.
Well, there you go.
And that's a great way to close, as we're coming to the end of our time slot here.
Do we have time for one more?
Sense.
So what's the plans for the future for Think Kids and CPS? Anything you ready to reveal?
A timely question, because we're coming up at the end of our last strategic plan, and we like to be sort of strategic in how we go about things. And we feel like we're doing a pretty good job of reaching a lot of kids and families. We reach probably close to 200,000 new kids and families a year these days.
Wow.
But,
amazing.
but we want to, in the next 5 years, reach a lot more. And to be able to do that, I think there are a number of things that we need to do. We need to make training more accessible for people, easier for them to access. We need to keep people connected in between training so that they get support and practice. And a big thing, though, really is, well, two things. One, we just need more people to learn about this, which is why I love conversations like this that hopefully get spread around, more people learn about it. And then we're going to really double down on our certified community. As you know, we have a big international community of people who are passionate, skilled experts in this approach. And what we're learning is there is no better way to have the approach get traction in a community, in an organization, than having it be led really by the internal experts, the people who are the credible messengers, if you will. And what we've shown is we can create a diverse group of people around the world from all different walks of life in different areas who can become incredibly passionate experts in collaborative problem solving. And we want to build that community exponentially and better support our certified trainers and certified practitioners to be able to go out and share it with others, teach others, support others as well. So that's going to be a major focus of ours.
Well, that's fantastic.
That's great.
And I know as an organization, we would love to be part of that. Because I feel the more parents and communities in even in our area that we could have start to think this way, the better it's going to do for the kids that come through our programs and the kids that we're trying to keep out of our programs.
Absolutely. And look, you all are the perfect example of what I was just talking about, right? So like I can go present at conferences around the country and tell people about collaborative problem solving and the benefits of it and things. It's going to be a lot more impactful if leaders and direct care staff in organizations say, here's what this is about. Here's why we tried it. Here's why it was hard, but here's why it's really important to do. Here's what we're finding. That's how you get traction in communities and settings. So, y'all are the perfect credible messengers and have been credible advocates for this work, not just in your area, but beyond. So, we're thrilled with our partnership and just wanting to create more partnerships like this.
Awesome.
Yeah, we appreciate it too. You've been just fantastic in helping us make this happen and making the transition over. And all the kids, I mean, everybody that we serve is just better because of it. So we thank you.
Well, look, thanks goes to you all for being brave enough to take it on, because to change systems requires disruption, and just like changing the brain requires stress. You've got to stress a system to change it. You got to stress it just enough, right? You can't overwhelm it. And you all have been courageous, brave, going out there and stressing the system to try to change it and make it better. And so we're really thankful that you all have been up for that and in it for the long haul to sort of see it through to get it to a point of sustainability. Absolutely. So we hope to continue the collaboration moving forward. And I appreciate y'all having me on for this conversation.
Sure.
It's super fun to reflect back a decade plus together and think about where we've been and where things are heading.
For those, just one last thing, those who are listening, this is a plug. If anybody out there gets a chance to see Dr. Perry and Dr. Ablon present together, not only do you learn an awful lot, but boy, it's entertaining too. They start feeding off each other, and it's really fun.
It is. So yeah, I have witnessed it myself. It is a great, and you'll go home asking yourself a bunch of questions about yourself and what you're doing.
Yep.
Well, it's great fun to teach with Bruce. I always learn a tremendous amount and have a great time doing it. So
that's awesome.
It's a blast. Well, and likewise with you all. Always enjoy the collaboration and learning along the way together. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you, Dr. Ablon.
Appreciate it.
Great to see you. Take care now.